English translation, 603rd Contact Sunday, the 14th of December 2014, 14:16 hours.
You are already waiting. Greetings and welcome, Ptah, my friend. Florina told me last night that you wanted to come here today before the correction work.
Greetings to you too, Edward. You told Florina that Bernadette was busy elsewhere today at the time when we usually turn to correction work. So I thought the two of us could talk together earlier, which is why I'm here now.
That is also fine with me, because instead of working on the computer, it is much more pleasant for me to have a conversation with you, and I have the following to say about that right at the beginning. Last Tuesday, I read this article in Zürcher Oberländer, the content of which referred to the nitrogen that has accumulated in the oceans. Quetzal and I already had a conversation in 1989 about artificial fertilizers and also about nitrogen, substances which the people of Earth irresponsibly apply to the soil in agriculture and horticulture, and which contaminate the soil and also the streams, rivers, lakes, streams, and oceans. So that was about 25 years ago, when it was said that the application of these substances had to be banned and everything had to be returned to naturalness. You can see what we discussed at that time from the following contact report excerpt from the 9th of November 1989. Billy, the whole thing can be just as unpleasant as what you said some time ago about the fact that nitrogen etc. destroys the oxygen in the water and in the cultivated soil of the fertilizers that are used in all agriculture and horticulture, and by private individuals for their gardens and lawns, etc. In this regard, Eva asked a professor at the University of Zurich about how long we would have to reckon before our land was oxygenated again and free of all artificial fertilizers irresponsibly introduced into the soil by former farmers. Without all kinds of artificial fertilizers and nitrogen being spread on the land all the time, nothing has grown anymore. The soil is completely exhausted and has become so oxygen depleted that hardly any grass grows. The explanation Eva received from a professor at the university was that we would have to reckon with 52 years before the country had recovered and regenerated.
You told me about that. With regard to the lack of oxygen that affects the lands of farmers and gardeners, it must be said that this is indeed a very serious factor that should be remedied by banning the application of artificial fertilizers and returning the soil and land to its natural state. If this does not happen, the time will come in the distant future when the land and the soil will become completely infertile and can still be stimulated to production by artificial fertilizers alone. This also applies to the waters, streams, rivers, lakes, and oceans in which the artificial fertilizer products, mainly nitrogen, rapidly develop enormous algae carpets which deprive the waters of all oxygen and cause them to die.
Yes, that's exactly what you said. Already 25 years ago, you had these insights and informed me about the degenerating consequences of the misuse of artificial fertilizers, and thus also of nitrogen on the seas, lakes, streams, and rivers, and also on agriculture and horticulture if these substances are not banned. Now, after 25 years, earthly scientists have finally come to the conclusion that at least the nitrogen in the oceans has accumulated in such a way that it has a harmful effect on the marine flora. Although apparently there is still no knowledge that the living organisms in the waters are also damaged by the nitrogen accumulation.
That cannot be changed, and unfortunately, there will be very unpleasant consequences from everything, including the way in which water lives. The consequences of nitrogen abuse alone will be very lasting. The same applies to all other artificial fertilizers and growth fuels which are used irresponsibly in agriculture and horticulture, making the soil completely leached and infertile in relation to the natural substances, so that only artificial fertilizers and growth substances can bring it to life.
It should also not be forgotten that the soil is compacted by heavy agricultural and horticultural machinery, which prevents oxygen from penetrating into the soil, and also kills soil microorganisms and other necessary soil organisms, as well as preventing rain and snow water from seeping away, which increasingly leads to land flooding.
That is true. These are other serious factors that are not taken into account in agriculture and horticulture.
In natural agriculture and horticulture, no artificial fertilizers and no artificial growth fertilizers may be used, but only purely natural substances, because otherwise the vital soil microorganisms die and make the soil infertile and, so to speak, dead. If, however, food plants are to grow again on such soil, it must first be recultivated, which can only happen by reactivating the soil through the addition of microorganisms and natural plant fertilizers. This also applies to our garden and the greenhouse, which have to be repaired because they have been mistreated and neglected since I handed over the reins years ago and no longer maintained the garden and greenhouse together with Silvano. Quetzal also complained a lot about the state of the garden and the greenhouse, so now I take the reins again and arrange everything in the right way together with Silvano. The garden and greenhouse soils must be reclaimed and reactivated. In this respect, natural substances, which have become known as EM products, and which we will now use to reactivate the exhausted, completely overgrown soils overgrown with moss and weeds, are particularly suitable. That is why I have been particularly interested in this matter lately, and have come across Adela's idea that a Japanese professor of agriculture named Teruo Higa made the so-called EM, or effective microorganisms, known at agricultural congresses through lectures through which the soil can be reclaimed and good harvests can be produced again. In this regard, I have already copied something that I want to read to you here, namely the history of the EM, as it is briefly described in the book EM Compact by Dr. Anne Katharina Zashoka.
The idea for the microorganism mixture, EM, originated more than 30 years ago from people on the Japanese island of Okinawa between Taiwan and Japan. Okinawa is called the Island of Death because it was one of the worst battles of the world wars. At the same time, Okinawa is called the Island of 100 Years because the life expectancy of the people who live there traditionally is the highest in the world. The effective microorganisms were discovered in this area of tension between life and death. Who has discovered the EM is not exactly known. There are contradictory statements about it. However, knowing the origins of EM is neither necessary nor helpful for its application. Among those who brought the EM to fruition were employees of Sanko Sangyo as a developer, the agronomy professor Teruo Higa, who worked on it, and the Ecological Spiritual Agricultural Association Sekai Kyusei Kyo, Religion for the Salvation of the World, at whose agricultural congresses EM were made known worldwide through lectures, among others by Professor Higa, for example in 1995 in Paris. EM are now known in almost every country in the world and are taught, recommended and used by the government in some schools and universities. Thailand and Costa Rica were the first to do so. It was and is always the initiative of individual enthusiastic people who promote and pass on knowledge, experience and practical application of the EM. The recipe for the EM had long remained secret in Japan, and the EM were initially imported from there. With the increasing scope of the application, the information about EM also shifted production to the individual countries, where today several manufacturers offer EM under different trade names. EM as microorganisms, which are composed of billions of years-old strains of tiny living beings, are naturally not suitable as objects for patents and sole ownership claims. There are therefore differences in the number of microbial strains in EM with different manufacturers, but neither original nor imitated EM. The composition of EM effective microorganisms is a mixture of lactic acid bacterial strains, yeasts, actinomycetes, and photosynthetic bacteria. Individual microbial strains each have their own abilities, but their effectiveness in EM comes from their interaction, as their metabolic properties complement each other perfectly. Photosynthetic bacteria are crucial for many effects of EM, but they are dependent on each other, on a team that complements each other. Oxygen-loving microorganisms, such as yeasts and photosynthetic bacteria, create an oxygen-poor environment in which they can develop their enzyme activity. EM are natural microorganisms and do not contain genetically modified strains. Photosynthesis bacteria are essential for the effectiveness of EM. The genus Rhodopseudomonas contained in the EM belongs to the ancient bacterial strains of geological history and is able to digest fats, organic acids, amino acids, sugars, alkaloids, and even aromatic compounds, such as benzene derivatives. With the enzyme nitrogenase formed by them, they can convert nitrogen gases into ammonium and further into organic compounds, and even render poisons, such as cyanide prussic acid, ineffective. How EM work? EM give an impulse to the environment and bring about a revival. This leads to the support and activation of the existing microorganisms and to the transformation of a disturbed habitat into a healthy one. The effect of EM is supported by a bacteria-friendly environment care. When using the EM, the following happens according to experience. A microbially impoverished environment is again populated with a variety of microbes. Through communication with the existing microorganisms, they provide an impulse for self-regulation in the sense of peaceful coexistence with each other and with the environment. EM support existing microorganisms in bringing blocked circuits back into flow. EM tune an environment to life-promoting effectiveness. Metabolic processes change. Matter is converted by the formation of nutrient substances. The resulting substances have an antioxidant effect. It comes to purification, clarification, and a higher energy level. Fine material vibrations enable a microbe-friendly harmonization. A degenerative environment is converted into a regenerative environment, so that pathogenic processes can be transformed into a healthy bacterial fungal colonization. It leads to healing.
This, then, applies to the EM, which I came across through Adela, and am now trying to get our garden and greenhouse back into shape, whose soils have been leached out and become ill as a result of poor management. A fact that could have happened because, as I said before, I had put all the gardening into other hands and so no longer tried to do it myself. But now that Quetzal has become agitated, angry and scolded, I have no choice but, together with Silvano, to return to gardening and greenhouse work, at least in the sense that I give instructions, and, together with Silvano, arrange everything and control everything throughout. But what I would like to say is that wood and plants can also be used for agriculture and horticulture by transforming these substances into ash by burning them. The materials used for wood and plant ash are therefore eliminated, and have been used since time immemorial as a good fertilizer in the garden, at least where the relevant knowledge prevails. A lot of wood ash can be produced at home in an open fireplace or wood stove, as well as garden waste such as vegetable waste and weeds can be burned into plant ash in the garden and used as fertilizer. Although nowadays, unfortunately, the ash is usually carelessly disposed of as waste. Unfortunately, many people are not aware that in many cases this waste product can also be used as a valuable fertilizer in the garden and in agriculture. In order to obtain clean wood or plant ash that is suitable for fertilizing the garden, a few basic things should be taken into account when making the fire. Because it starts with lighting the fire, for which only types of paper should be used that are neither varnished nor strongly chemically treated. Newsprint printed only in black and white or normal black is considered a good choice. Such paper is usually only slightly treated, and the printing ink through which the paper is inscribed is made of carbon black pigments. Such newsprint does not leave any harmful residues after incineration, so printed paper of this type is suitable as fertilizer when burnt to ash. High-gloss catalogs and papers embossed with continuous color or multicolor printing are chemically treated and, after combustion, contain heavy metals and other toxic elements which unnecessarily contaminate the ash, and should therefore not be used to light fires or as ash. But also, untreated cardboard can be used to light the wood or plant fire. But care must be taken that no plastic adhesive tapes stick to the cardboard, because if they burn together, they damage the quality of the ash. Untreated or unprinted and undyed cartons are recognizable by their brown matte color, whereby the carbon black pigments of the black lettering do not contain any harmful substances either. When selecting wood and plants, care must be taken that only natural wood and plants are used for ash production. Wood that has been chemically treated, for example varnished, as well as plants that have been chemically treated, often have a very high pollutant content. Heavy metals such as lead, chromium, nickel, or cadmium, etc. are found in such ashes. Ash from hard coal should not be used as fertilizer, and should not be mixed with wood or vegetable coal because the coal also contains pollutants such as sulfur oxides which are introduced into the ash. However, if the wood is untreated, all types of wood can be used to make wood ash and then fertilize it. It is also a fact that clean wood and plant ash contains many important elements, such as lime, potassium, phosphate, and iron, etc., which are well suited for fertilizing the garden and the land. And it must be known that ash is strongly alkaline, which means that it neutralizes acid soils. It is therefore very suitable for improving the buffer capacity in acidified soils, but should not be used to fertilize bog bed plants such as rhododendrons, because they love acidic soils.
You speak in our sense of eliminating wood and plants to turn them into ash. By eliminating, however, Earth humans unfortunately understand something wrong, because they associate this term with death and complete annihilation, which however corresponds to a completely wrong understanding, which is why we should explain some more about it. But first this. Depending on the species, wood and plant ashes have a very effective effect as a natural fertilizer because they dissolve very quickly and penetrate well into the soil. In order not to over-fertilize the garden, the guideline value of 300 grams per square meter or 3 kilograms per 10 square meters per year should not be exceeded. With this amount, the nutrient requirements of the soil are well covered.
Ash can also be added to the compost. Therefore, if wood ash is obtained from untreated wood and vegetable waste and weeds, plant ash can also be used for composting because it has a positive effect on the composting process when it is incorporated into the compost in layers and in smaller quantities. But what about the heavy metals contained in the wood and plant ashes? I do not know.
Heavy metals that are introduced into the compost, garden, or soil through ashes are not in any way a cause for concern. The heavy metal that trees, vegetables, and plants extract from the biosphere corresponds to a natural heavy metal load that is introduced into the soil by rain, snow, and wind, which is practically identical to the concentration in wood and plant ash. In this respect, there is no need to worry about this in private use.
As far as I know, in Switzerland, wood ash is stupidly disposed of as household waste, at least in cities. To what extent this corresponds to correctness, however, is unknown to me. On the other hand, I know from various people who run private gardens that they effectively use wood ash as a natural garden fertilizer. It can also be said that wood ash in particular is suitable for sprinkling icy pavements, was previously used as toothpaste, and is also suitable as a good metal cleaning agent, but can also be used to make soap. In earlier times, wood ash was also used as a good and non-flammable insulation material by filling the cavities of houses with it when they were being built. So especially wood ash could and can be used as fertilizer, but it can also be used for other useful purposes. But as I said, both wood and plant ash for fertilizing in the garden is a well-known valuable thing.
What you have done may also be important for all those Earth humans who are involved in agriculture and horticulture, because the whole thing in relation to the EM is an effectively important thing that should be considered and applied. For my part, I have been familiar with the advent of EM for years, so I am not confronted with anything new with regard to what you said in the book EM Compact. The fact that you now take over the supervision and control of the garden and the greenhouse again at Quetzal's request brings you some extra work, which you can share with Silvano.
That's what Silvano and I have planned.
That'll make Quetzal happy, and I'll go along with that joy. I also looked at the garden and the greenhouse when Quetzal asked me about it, and I have to say that what I saw shocked me as much as Quetzal did. And when I think about how everything was good, proper, and in order when you first worked and cared for the garden and the greenhouse together with Jacobus and then with Silvano, then I have to say that what was done by others and what I saw corresponded to a mismanagement and loveless carelessness.
Bang, that's clear. But I assure you, everything will be put right now.
I have no doubt that you will be able to do so if you will once again supervise the garden and greenhouse maintenance yourself.
So that's clear. Then I would like to say the following to you. Before we deal again with the term elimination, Bernadette told me that Chris in Poland is concerned with peace symbolism, which you and I have already talked about. Now Chris reported that when he dealt more intensively with the rune of death, which has been used worldwide for a long time as a false peace symbol, this has triggered very negative and bad movements of consciousness and psyche in him. In my opinion, however, this is only an inevitable consequence of the symbol of death, the rune of death, which as such has a negative and bad effect on consciousness, thoughts, feelings, and the psyche, which is why, since this symbol of death has been used as a false symbol of peace, the people who mistakenly bind themselves to this symbol have degenerated into consciousness, thought, feeling, and psychology, and also into their behavior patterns. This appears in innumerable people, but the people affected vehemently deny it.
What you're saying is right. The rune of death, like any negative symbol, contains the property that it negatively influences the consciousness of a person in a bad way. The death rune itself, which is used as a false peace symbol, creates fear and discord in people, as well as hatred and disharmony. This is the reason why man becomes degenerate, selfish and indifferent to his peers and to a righteous order in the human and social realms in relation to these unworthy values, whereby paradoxically this indifference goes hand in hand with a blatant false humanity. False humanism has infested the unrealistic human being, who is ignorant and inexperienced with regard to reality and its truth, as well as effeminate, wrong thinking and wrong feeling, and who is driven by greed for possession and power, egoism, jealousy, and all sorts of personal profit-related calculation, whereby he is not able to perceive these unworthiness in himself and also not to understand it, because he is completely blind to his own wrong behavior. False humanism also drives people to revenge and retaliation, very often with religious sectarian aspects, which is why many false humanists advocate the death penalty and also acts of war, because they are of the mistaken belief that problems could be solved or prevented. Already by this fact alone, the false humanism reveals itself, which unfortunately very often produces degenerations, because the right way of life is not found and thus false ideals are pursued, which often arise through religious sectarian false doctrines.
We have talked about false humanism, degeneration and elimination of these factors in humans again and again since the beginning of our contacts. But Earthlings obviously misunderstood several times what their Pleiaren actually mean by elimination. Unfortunately, the people of Earth usually only understand that something is completely extinguished or destroyed or killed with regard to elimination, which does not correspond to the correctness. because also in Earth-human linguistic usage this term means approximately the same as with plejaren. Elimination, for example, means that a person must be removed from a larger complex. That is to say, in the case of a degeneration or gross fallibility of a human being in relation to society. Elimination simply means that something is superfluous, faulty, insufficient, or harmful, etc., and switched off or on. Must be eliminated, whereby elimination means nothing other than being segregated, whereby the fallible or degenerate human being is specially treated and removed from the path in a way that is to be understood as segregating, rejecting, eliminating, excluding, sorting out, expel, screening, deporting, removing, separately treating, removing, isolating, neutralizing, separating, chasing away, repulsing, and banishing. So the elimination in no way means that a fallible or degenerate person should be robbed of his life or killed, because such action would be against the creational natural laws and recommendations. So even if there was repeated talk of elimination at the beginning of our contact talks from 1975 onwards, this was always meant in the sense I just mentioned, but never in any other way or in the way that a life was to be extinguished, as unfortunately, as I know, was assumed by certain Earthlings who did not try to get to the bottom of the term elimination, because in their ignorance they thought themselves clever enough to understand the term correctly. So if a person is to be eliminated because of his degeneracy, such as capital crimes, etc., this does not mean that he is to be killed, but that he is to be removed from society, such as in relation to serving a sentence in a prison or penitentiary, which you simply refer to as the place of performance. Otherwise, elimination to a place of performance may also mean exile to a place far from any society. It is clear to say that an elimination in this sense and according to your plejaren sense in no way means that a degenerate life is killed, but that it, just a human being, is only separated from society to a safe place where no disadvantages and no more damage can arise for society. A person eliminated in this way, or separated from society, thus only loses his social freedom, but not his life, nor all the necessary possibilities for the continuation of his life, because he is also given all the necessities of life in the event of elimination or instruction or banishment to a suitable place of measure fulfillment. As a rule, such an eliminated person must work for his livelihood at the respective place of measure fulfillment, and also learn to make himself a righteous person who, if he is not sent into exile for life, can be comprehensively reintegrated into society and lead a just life through rehabilitation. And once again, elimination is not a killing, but only a necessary separation from society or from a territory, etc. This also applies when we are talking about life that is unworthy of life and completely degenerated.
I can only say that your statements are entirely accurate.
Well, then I want to pick up something that your father Svath told me because I was interested in it, but about which you, Quetzal, and Simyase also talked to me, that there are different material comets, such as rock comets, metal comets, pure mineral comets, and ice comets, whereby you also said that water is not simply water because there are different compositions in this respect. So far everything is clear to me, but now it has been established with the Rosetta, that is to say Philae probe on Comet 67P/Skurjumov-Gerasimenko, that this one is hard as nails, covered with a thick layer of dust and completely different from what you told me about comets. Hence the question whether it can still be determined whether water is present.
On the one hand, it is correct that water does not have to be the same as water or H2O, because there are other chemical compositions in this respect. And on the other hand, it has to be said that Comet 67P/Churyumov-Gerasimenko belongs to a different kind than those who brought water to Earth, because these were ice comets and therefore not rock comets like the one on which the Philae probe was landed. What will now be analyzed and discovered by the probe on the comet, that I have not explored in advance, but despite the near availability of the probe, will be unquestionable that certain important data for earthly scientists are to be expected. And if you refer to asteroids, which also brought water to the early Earth, then of course this corresponds to correctness, whereby it must be understood. However, that not only these were responsible for the emergence of water on Earth, but also small and smallest minerals containing water, which fell from the world space to Earth. It must also be understood that water has developed on Earth itself, so that not everything was brought from the world space by comets, asteroids, and minerals, because as on every planet in early times, there was a chemical momentum of its own on Earth with regard to the emergence of water, and consequently most of the water on the planet itself has arisen. The water brought to Earth by comets and asteroids is, however, small in relation to the large waters, such as oceans, which have been created by chemical processes of Earth and its atmosphere and climate, etc., as well as by world space influences on the planet itself.
Yes, Svath, your father said that, but the scientists of Earth are of the erroneous opinion that all water was brought from the world space, because they cannot imagine that water develops by certain chemical processes also from planets themselves. But then there's this. In the Milky Way, there are planets that do not revolve around a home star, such as the former destroyer, and the dark planet, which as nemesis is also a headache for earthly scientists. I know of you about the actual existence of such dark planets or ghost planets, as Svath once called them, but you also call them wandering planets, which roam the Milky Way and also in the outer universe as large lonely space bodies and even in the area of the Sol system, whereby the dark planet Nemesis is supposed to penetrate the inner solar system again and again. 10 such freely wandering planets have now been discovered by scientists who call them orphan planets, and estimate that there are twice as many as there are stars. Astrophysicists say that these are large and Jupiter-like planets, which can be up to several times larger than Jupiter itself. These formations ghost through the universe and through the Milky Way because they are not held in a path by any sun. These orphan planets, the scientists say, are possibly, as I said, more frequent than stars.
Scientists from New Zealand's MOA Microlensing Observation and Astrophysics Observatory have taken a close look at the center of the Milky Way, actually discovering 10 orphaned planets that do not orbit the Sun. However, these are not the dark planets or wandering planets that can be calculated approximately with the size of Earth or even once or twice larger, and that do not travel on fixed orbits through the Milky Way and through the universe as well as through the Sol system, of which my father also reported to you. Many of these dark planets or traveling planets move without a fixed orbit through the galactic outer space, whereby they can only rarely be observed once from Earth with suitable instruments and apparatus, if at all. Contrary to this, the orphan planets discovered by the scientists move in a stable orbit around a center in the galaxy, of which there are indeed many. The orbit can be around the center of the galaxy as well as far away in the outer region of a solar system. Compared to solar formations, these planets are relatively small, which is why they have so far been overlooked by earthly scientists. But what will change now as they have gained knowledge and are searching for it?
Then that's settled too. Lately we have been talking about marine and other water pollution by plastic and other plastics, for which I have the question whether you have been able to comply with my request in the meantime and clarify how much plastic and other plastics enter and contaminate the waters in Switzerland each year. On the other hand, a program was shown on television that was exactly related to this matter, so I looked on the internet to see what was happening in Switzerland in this regard. I found the following and copied it out.
First inventory of microplasty in Swiss waters.
Bern 11.12 2014. On behalf of the FOIN, EPF Lausanne has investigated Swiss waters for the presence of tiny plastic particles, so-called microplastics. Microplastic particles were detected in most of the samples from the 6 Swiss lakes and the Rhone. Although the measured concentrations pose no direct threat to the environment and water quality, their occurrence in water bodies is undesirable and affects the current prohibition of pollution in water protection legislation. Numerous studies have already been carried out on the contamination of the oceans with microplastics. On the other hand, hardly any data is available to date on the pollution of inland waters. The FOAN has therefore commissioned the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne EPFL to carry out an initial assessment of the state of Swiss waters and to identify possible impacts. Between June and November 2013, samples were taken from Lake Geneva, Lake Constance, Lake Neuchâtel, Lake Maggiore, Lake Zurich, and Lake Brienz, and from the Rhône near Chancy on the border with France. These samples from the water surface and the sand of beaches were examined for the occurrence and type of plastic particles, with a size between 0.3 and 5 mm. Microplasty detected in almost all samples. The investigation of the lakes and the Rhône was carried out with the aid of a net that was towed over a distance of 3 to 4 kilometers over the surface of the water. In 27 samples, the researchers found an average of about 0.1 microplastic particles per square meter of water surface, with 7 samples containing no microplastic. The values of individual samples between and within the lakes varied widely, indicating differences in the load in the zones near and far from the shore, as well as strongly fluctuating discharges into the lakes over time. For example, the highest concentrations were measured after a thunderstorm, which suggests that microplastics are washed away by runoff rainwater. The population density in the catchment area had no influence on the extent of the pollution. Based on the results from the Rhône, it was estimated that approximately 10 kilograms of microplastics per day are transported through the river to France and can therefore contribute to marine pollution. Of the 33 sand samples taken from the beaches of the lakes studied, 12 were free of microplasty. The average load was around 1,000 microplastic particles per square meter. Most of the microplastics in the samples' water and beaches were plastic fragments, mainly polyethylene PE or polypropylene PP, which are typically found in packaging. The second most common category was foams of insulation materials, see Case 1. No direct risk to the environment or health. The measured concentrations show that natural organic particles, and thus potential food for plankton-eating organisms, outweigh microplastics. However, 3 of the 40 fish examined and 8 of the 9 bird carcasses found and examined contained small amounts of microplastic in the digestive tract. However, it is difficult to draw conclusions from these initial observations. Measured in terms of hazard potential, microplastics is currently not a priority problem for the water quality of Swiss waters, in contrast to micropollutants, for example pesticides. The risk of microplastics entering drinking water via groundwater or seawater is classified as low. Microplastics are removed from the water by filtration during drinking water treatment. From today's perspective, there is therefore no health risk for humans. In addition, only relatively small quantities of pollutants are likely to be transported from the microplastic into the water bodies. Reducing the discharge of plastics into the environment, plastics are only degraded very slowly in the water. The contamination of water bodies with microplastics is undesirable and affects the current ban on pollution of water bodies. Measures at source are needed to reduce the impact of plastics on the environment, see Box 2. This first inventory must be complemented by future studies on the relative contributions of sources such as wastewater treatment plants, watercourses, rainwater discharges, and road drainage, as well as the environmental relevance of plastic particles smaller than 0.3 mm. Case 1. Types of microplasty that have been found. With 60% of the particles detected in the water samples, plastic fragments dominated, mainly made of polyethylene PE or polypropylene PP. 10% of the particles consisted mainly of expanded polystyrene EPS, which is frequently used in insulation materials. Other frequently found particle types are foils or fibers. In the sand samples, 50% of the particles belonged to the foam category. The plastic cellulose acetate, from which cigarette filters are made, has also been proven. Industrially produced microplastics, such as the PE beads used in care products, accounted for only a tiny proportion of the total microplastics. Case 2. Federal measures. At a round table, the federal government, cantons, cities and municipalities, representatives of the retail trade and the plastics industry are looking for solutions for improved recycling, which will include PET and PE packaging as well as other plastics. Similarly, in its coordinating role, the FOIN has been organizing a round table on measures to combat litter for a number of years. It is up to the cantons and communes to combat it. Further measures, such as the elimination or reduction of plastics in certain applications or improvements in quality, must also be sought. To reduce the impact of plastics on the seas, the federal government is pursuing an internationally coordinated approach, including within the framework of the Treaty for the Protection of the North Sea and the Northeast Atlantic OSPAR and the International Commission for the Protection of the Rhine ICPR.
I cannot answer your question in such a way that I could give you an exact measure of the total amount of water pollution from plastics in Switzerland, because that would require precise research. So I can only name one result of our calculations, which refers to about 5 tons of plastic and other plastic wastes per month, which get into Swiss waters and into the land areas and which mostly settle on the water bodies, decompose there and become microplastics, which is absolutely not harmless, but affects the environment and is very harmful to the health of all living beings on land and in water. Therefore, if it is stated in this internet excerpt that there is no immediate danger to the environment and to health, then this corresponds on the one hand to an unforgivable research structure and short-sightedness with regard to the statements of the responsible researchers and scientists, who deal with the matter inappropriately, as well as a trivialization of the real danger and harmfulness of the whole. And on the other hand, this statement expresses an irresponsible assertion, which fundamentally contradicts the effective reality and its truth. The reason for this is that the already existing pollution of water by plastic and other plastics has far exceeded the harmless level, especially in the form of microplastics. Large parts of nature and the environment in general are already damaged, as are the health of humans and water organisms, birds, animals, amphibians, and reptiles. But this is not the full extent of the spoilage in Switzerland, because in addition to pollution from plastic and other plastics, there are all sorts of other toxic and non-toxic waste materials, which are also thrown irresponsibly into the water, as well as into fields, gardens, roads and paths, and into meadows and forests, and which contribute their dangerous part to damaging or even destroying the health of humans and all other living creatures, as well as the entire flora. Thus, through this irresponsibility in the fauna, thousands of life forms of all genera and species mutate in order to adapt to the changes caused by human guilt through mutation. This is when they are able to survive their mutation and do not even die out.
The Swiss Federal Office for the Environment FON, the competent authority for the environment and for the sustainable use of natural resources, as well as the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology ETH and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology ETH, are responsible for the report. But if they now claim that everything is neither a threat to the environment nor to health, Then this irresponsibility corresponds to a non-recognition of the facts and the truth, as well as a misleading of the population.
You can put it that way because it corresponds to a far-reaching misleading and trivialization of the effective facts and facts. In reality, the decay of plastic and other plastics results in such fine nanoparticles that they cannot be detected in a superficial control and analysis of microplastics and other plastics. Because more profound methods of investigation and analysis are required than only superficial ones in order to detect them. It is precisely these nanoparticles that pose the greatest effective threat to human health and to all forms of fauna and flora of all kinds, since they impair all their organic functions and cause serious damage to health and even mutations. But that's not all, because plastic in particular has the property of binding PCBs to itself, which are released into the water, earth, and the environment through the irresponsibility of earthlings. PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls, or toxic and cancer-causing organic chlorine compounds that were released into the aquatic environment early on due to the carelessness and irresponsibility of people on Earth. They persist for a very long time and bind to plastics that are discarded carelessly and irresponsibly and are released into all waters, Earth, the environment in general, and the atmosphere of Earth. If the plastic, like all other plastics, becomes microplastic in the course of time and finally is pulverized and dissolved into tiny nanoparticles, then the PCBs remain in it and have a damaging effect on the health of all forms of life, be it water and land creatures or man himself. But this is precisely what the FOAN and the ETH are trivializing, which corresponds to irresponsibility that is not easy to outbid. PCBs are still effective today in the environment, in the soil, and in water, even if they were released into it decades ago. It is a product of the terrestrial industrial chemical industry, namely very toxic substances, which have been used since 1929 for their production and in a variety of applications, for example in hydraulic systems as hydraulic fluid, especially in electrical capacitors, in fluorescent lamps and tubes, as well as in transformers, washing machines, spin dryers, and other devices with capacitor motors. PCBs have also been used in industrial reactive current compensation systems, as well as plasticizers and sealants, insulators, plastics, and paints, etc. These are liquids which, in their pure form, are yellowish and almost odorless. In recent times, earthly scientists have referred to them as the dirty dozen of known organic toxins. In 2001, however, the Stockholm Convention banned PCBs worldwide. But this did not prevent these very dangerous and extremely harmful toxins from spreading all over the world, poisoning water, the atmosphere, and in many places, the soil. The toxins have been preserved until today and are absorbed by the plastic nanoparticles, etc., of life forms of all kinds with the food, but also by skin contact. Because certain organisms that are able to degrade PCBs do not live from these toxins alone due to a lack of nitrogen and are unable to find the important nutrients elsewhere, they are virtually not biologically degraded, which has the serious consequence that they can be integrated into plastics and thus also into micro and nanoplastics. In the past, PCBs and insulating oils containing PCBs were also used in capacitor production, with the capacitors leaking as a result of mechanical destruction or decomposition processes and releasing the PCBs, thus contaminating the environment. Compared to other insulating oils, chlorodiphenyl smells intensely fruity even in very small quantities, and it is also dangerous to come into contact with it through skin contact, because it is also absorbed through the pores. The effects on health can be very drastic if chronic toxicity occurs, which can occur even at low levels. PCBs cause effects such as chloroquine, but also hair loss, hyperpigmentation, and immune system damage due to immune poisoning. Cancer of various kinds, Alzheimer's disease, liver damage, Parkinson's disease, and malformations, etc. PCBs bioaccumulate in the food chain and are also highly carcinogenic in this way. Physical and conscious development is also affected by PCBs, as well as their hormonal negative effects, such as the hormonal balance of male fetuses and children, which they interfere with. They also promote infertility to a large extent in men and male animals. In all kinds of animals, in amphibians, reptiles, fish, and birds, but also in various other hormone-related diseases, ailments, and feminization. Even the smallest amounts of PCBs ingested are harmful. That is to say, even substances ingested by plastic nanoparticles contaminated with these toxins. Thus, PCB-contaminated particles are extremely harmful to health if these toxins enter the organic cycle of the terrestrial human being or other living beings through plastic secretions as well as through microplastics and nanoparticles resulting from them. The toxins accumulate in the organisms of all life forms which are at the beginning or end of the food chain and which are poisoned by their food intake or by physical contact with PCBs. And the fact that this is concealed by the responsible researchers and scientists is absolutely incomprehensible and even contemptuous of life and criminal.
This can't be any different. But something else. You said that you wanted Guido's book to have my name listed on the cover of the author's name. Bernadette now thinks that your name also belongs to it, because we two have edited the work fundamentally together. How do you feel about that?
Rightly so, it should be, yes, so I can agree with that.
Then that is also clear. But it must also be said that everyone who has worked on the book so far is named by name and area of work. Whether it be Elizabeth's copy work, your and my total editing work, Bernadette's pre- and post-editing work, or all the proofreaders.
This is correct, because not only one person alone is decisively involved in this book production, but so many employees unite in the preparatory work alone that they are justly to be named and listed.
It's done the way you say, it's a clear case.
Then I want to discuss the following privately with you.